You can respect Barack Obama and Donald Trump at the same time. Not politically necessarily and not necessarily morally, but instead as case studies in how humans play the game of life, right? Motivation, rhetoric, risk, failure, and comeback. That's the lens of this video, a mindset that I'll call correctism. The idea that all things are basically true and correct to some extent from some perspective that you can learn from. Any worldview or idea or person contains something you can learn from, some element of truth if you're willing to appreciate it. And we're going to tie that into the fierce urgency of now, how fragile civilization actually is, politics and scams as system gaming, the weird honesty of advertising and religion, and finally a challenge, finding something good in the person you hate most. Think of the public figure who makes your blood boil, right? Now imagine a world where you're actually learning from them, stealing their best traits, and maybe you're even genuinely grateful that they exist. That may sound wrong, especially in a world where politics is a team sport, but here's the twist. If you refuse to see anything admirable in your enemies, you're not actually protecting your morals. Instead, you're limiting your toolbox. Barack Obama and Donald Trump are perfect examples, because when Obama ran for office in 2008, invoking what Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech, and later writings to warn that waiting for justice is itself a moral choice, Trump launched his 2016 run by declaring, on the other hand, that the American dream is dead. But if I win, I will bring it back. And of course, the famous phrase that together we will make America great again. It's a different style, different ideology for sure, but in both cases, they're telling a very old, very powerful story. Things are broken. You are not powerless. Act now. You're allowed to dislike both of them if you want, or love both of them, love one or hate another. But if you refuse to see what makes their messages work, you miss a lesson about human motivation that you could be using in your own life. And that's the shift that I'm inviting you into, this fierce urgency of now. And that's moral rhetoric, but it also has this weird analog in physics. Because in special relativity, if you follow the path of a photon, a particle of light moving, of course, at light speed, the proper time along that pathway is going to be zero. Mathematically, photons travel on null world lines. There is no ticking time clock in their own reference frame. As one physicist puts it, for massless particles, there is no passage of proper time. To massless particles, eternity is just no big deal. You can't say what a photon experiences because experience itself is an emergent macroscopic property, but along its path there is no before and no after. Just kind of an eternal now. That is a great metaphor, I believe, for how life feels when you stop procrastinating finally. The wall between someday and now collapses. The problem, I think, is that most of us live in the opposite mode of operation. That is, I'll start the gym tomorrow. I'll launch that new project later this week or next month. I'll get my finances together when things finally calm down. When things slow down a little bit, they never will. Something's always going to come up, right? Unexpectedly is what we should expect. But if the real reason is fear of failure, fear of not already being perfect, then tomorrow is just a polite word for never. You're not going to give your future self more time. You're hiding from the possibility that your first draft might be ugly. And it will be. It will be ugly. Wanting financial freedom in a year or going viral overnight without the boring part, consistent effort, skill building, sacrifice, it's just another get-rich-quick fantasy. Right. Sustainable success still comes from direction, exertion, and perseverance, not lottery tickets. If fear is the reason you're waiting for tomorrow, tomorrow is actually infinity. The fierce urgency of now is not just a civil rights slogan. It's also a personal rule. The only time you'll ever do anything is now. So now zoom out from your life to all of civilization there's this comforting story that humanity just got smart relatively recently, that for thousands of generations we were sort of fumbling around in the dark, and then in the last 100 or 200 years, we suddenly became enlightened. The numbers say otherwise, because in the last 100,000 years, right, we've passed 3,000 to 4,000 generations of people. Do we seriously think nobody learned anything useful in all that time, and that the 5 or 10 recent generations invented all the wisdom that matters? Obviously not. I mean, meanwhile, scholars who study societal collapse, from Joseph Tainter's classic The Collapse of Complex Societies to newer syntheses, keep pointing out a certain scary pattern, that collapse usually means a rapid loss of complexity over the series of a few decades, rather than a slow fade over millennia. One 2024 review by Danilo Brozovic, which looked at hundreds of studies and books on failed civilizations, notes that collapse is typically defined as a sharp breakdown in social and political complexity over a few decades at most. And what that's going to feel like in practice is maybe half a generation, maybe 2 generations where one cohort fails to pass on crucial skills, values, and knowledge to the next, and at that point, decay happens. It is lost. We stagnate, and anything that you think is a straight line is actually a complex exponential function of an approximation of a curve of a straight line that is actually going some way or another, up or down. Without maintaining things, they will decline, for sure. So when we casually forget old traditions, right, or treat inherited wisdom as boomer nonsense, we're playing a pretty dangerous game. Civilization is a stack of interlocking habits and stories that have to be reinforced each generation. If we let that transfer break, even for 10 or 20 years, history suggests that things can go very wrong very fast. Progress is real, but progress without memory is how societies drive straight into walls that they've hit before, because we all know history rhymes. And we're used to thinking in binary, right? Progress is good, so therefore tradition is, well, in the way of progress, so therefore kind of bad, perhaps. Well, reality requires more clarification. Yes, many trends do follow exponential curves of growth, technology, information, even population growth at times, until, of course, we reach a carrying capacity, which is always going to exist on this planet. But small changes compound and suddenly you get huge shifts is the main idea here, right? That's built into how complex systems behave. But those same positive feedback loops can flip. The same complexity that gives you smartphones and global trade can also give you fragility, disinformation cascades, and ultimately collapses when the system gets too tangled to manage. Tainter's point about societies hitting peak complexity before they fall is exactly that. The tools that solve problems eventually create new, harder and more complex problems faster than many of us can actually adapt. So at the personal level and at the civilizational level, you need a balance, right? A big chunk of your life is to be built on stable traditions, proven habits, values, institutions, while a smaller, more experimental slice is where you tinker and innovate. If everything is changing all the time, you don't know what better even means. You lose your baseline. But of course, if nothing changes, then you stagnate. Think of it like this. Let 80% of your life be boringly traditional, because boredom is, after all, a modern luxury. And therefore, you can use the remaining 20 to 25% to run experiments on top of that solid base of reliability. Civilizations work the same way. The trick is to honor the deep wisdom encoded in old stories and practices while still updating them for the world we actually live in, gradually. So what is this correctism thing again? Well, here's another way to define it. It's the practice of saying, what reference frame could this be at least partly true from? Instead of jumping straight to, this is just a dumb and wrong idea, full stop. It's not that anything goes. Not all truths are equal. Rather, there is some discipline in looking for the context in which someone's belief or behavior makes some kind of sense. Here are a few foundations for that. Language and metrics are human-made. We decide what counts as success, fairness, safety, and freedom. Different choice gives us different answers. We care about truth mostly because accuracy helps us survive. People's views are usually anchored in lived experiences and perceived threats, not abstract logic. There's actual data backing up the idea that meeting people in their experience is more persuasive than pounding them with facts. A 2021 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences ran 15 studies on political disagreement. Across issues like guns, taxes, immigration, and climate, people respected opponents more when their views were explained through personal experiences, especially experiences of harm. Those stories made opponents seem more rational and increased willingness to interact across political lines. Other research on contact theory shows that both direct and mediated exposure to people from the other side through conversations, media, and storytelling can reduce prejudice by lowering anxiety and building empathy. Correctism is basically contact theory applied to ideas. You assume that even a viewpoint you dislike might be the best that person could do with their experiences, their information. And you might ask, when would this actually be reasonable? What fear or harm might this be protecting against? What skill or value is hidden inside this behavior? You don't have to adopt their worldview, but you do try to extract the small piece that might be worth keeping. Once you do that, something interesting happens. It becomes very hard to completely dehumanize people, even the ones whose policies or behavior you strongly oppose. We love saying from time to time that all politicians are corrupt or both parties are terrible in the U.S. political system. And sure, there's plenty to criticize in any political system. It's never going to be perfect. But it's also true that politics is, in many ways, a game of gaming systems. There are rules, written and unwritten. There are incentives, media cycles, donor networks, social norms, the Overton window. There are thousands of players competing for limited attention, money, and votes. And some people just happen to get really good at that game. Take Representative from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Biographically, she's almost too on the nose, right? Bronx-born, Boston University grad in international relations and economics, and then back working as a waitress, bartender, while organizing politically. In 2018, she unseated a powerful 10-term incumbent in a primary upset, and then took office at age 29 as the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. You can hate her policies, absolutely. You can think democratic socialism is a bad idea. But it's hard to say that she's actually not skilled, right? I mean, think about it. She read the district correctly. She built a ground game that beat a long-entrenched machine, and she uses social media more effectively than most of Congress, being a millennial. Correctism says, even if you'd never, ever vote for her, what can you learn from her? Well, how she tells a story, how she mobilizes supporters, how she frames herself as an underdog, and then her overall charisma. The same applies to Trump's 2015 launch speech. In his official announcement, he framed himself as the only one willing to say that the American dream is dead. But if I win, I will bring it back bigger and stronger and better than ever before. And of course, famously ending with "Together we will make America great again." You can dissect the flaws in that narrative. You can be horrified by parts of his speech or whatever, but that basic emotional arc that we are losing, but we can win again, you are part of the comeback, we will do it together, has been motivating people since ancient war leaders and revival preachers. Correctism doesn't mean that you endorse someone. It just means you don't close your eyes to the skills that made them effective, like coalition building, rhetoric, branding, and timing. The same logic applies to people who are obviously in the wrong from your perspective. In 2022, for instance, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charged 8 social media influencers with a $100 million stock manipulation scheme. and they allegedly promoted stocks to hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter and Discord, and then they did a pump and dump scheme where they secretly dumped their shares once the prices rose. Regulators are now more openly worried about how low-cost trading apps plus hyped-up online communities, like the GameStop saga in the recent decade, can blur the line between crowdsourced enthusiasm and manipulation. Morally, that's kind of grim, but technically, it's a masterclass in storytelling, like we're all going to the moon on this trade, if you follow me on my Discord recommendations, social proof and the fear of missing out, and understanding platform incentives. And again, you don't have to respect the ethics here to recognize that there's a skill set there that you might want to repurpose for something actually constructive, something actually good. Once you see systems like this everywhere, the whole world starts looking a little bit scammy, does it not? Advertising, for example, likes to live in this little gray zone. Psychologists talk about the halo effect, when one positive trait, like physical attractiveness, makes us assume a person, product, or brand is good in other ways too. Studies have found that attractive people are often judged as more intelligent, more competent, even more honest, and they can literally earn more money in tips and salary, not because of their actual performance, but because of that halo. Marketers also know this, of course, and that's why the city in the car commercial doesn't have any traffic even though it's downtown in a crowded metro. Or the lifestyle in the ad is impossibly effortless and seamless, sleek, etc. Or just the model in it is smiling with the product, radiating health and happiness. That obviously did not come from buying the product itself, whether it's a phone case or a watch or a dental product. And they don't say that you'll become that person, right? Because legally they know they have to avoid these explicit falsehoods, but they design everything to encourage the implication, at least, the halo effect, right? That your life will drift closer to that image if you buy this. Is that a scam? Well, in one frame, yes. It's monetized, intentional misinterpretation that it's portraying or hoping for you to believe in. But from the other perspective, it's just socially accepted persuasive ability, right? Correctism says both are somewhat true, and you can condemn the manipulative parts and recognize still that humans respond strongly to images and stories, not just raw facts. Most of us are okay with system being rigged slightly in our favor, like the lottery, and the boundary between legitimate business and mildly exploitative scheme is blurry and constantly negotiated. Seeing this stuff clearly won't turn you into an inherent cynic, but ideally it turns you into someone who is harder to fool and uses the same tools carefully and honestly instead of pretending you're above them. But what is it that lies above? Is anyone truly above anyone else, and why? Ask the question why enough times in a row, in fact, and you'll quickly land in philosophical spiritual territory. Why is there something rather than nothing? What are we supposed to be doing here? And where, if anywhere, are we going afterwards? And where do we come from? Most of humanity doesn't try to answer those questions alone. It's too daunting, right? About 84% of the world's population, of course, has some kind of religious affiliation. And it used to be even higher, but it's still very high. Religions provide community moral codes, rituals, and large-scale narratives about meaning. Modern psychology and psychiatry increasingly recognize that religious and spiritual engagement can correlate with lower rates of depression and anxiety, better coping with trauma, stronger social support and sense of belonging, and sometimes even better physical health outcomes, partly because of healthier behavior and community support. You don't have to believe any particular religious doctrine literally to see the instrumental wisdom here. The Bible's log in your own eye line is basically an ancient warning about projection bias. Buddhist teachings about attachment map eerily well onto modern ideas about addiction and craving. Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, and other traditions all encode intergenerational lessons about justice, restraint, generosity, and identity that helped communities survive. Correctism treats religions as compressed survival data, cultural operating systems that stuck around because they worked well enough to help their carriers compete, reproduce, and find meaning. You can still be atheistic, agnostic, or fiercely loyal to just one tradition, regardless, but the point here is simply, if billions of people have used a story to structure their lives for centuries, there's probably something in that story worth understanding, even if you reject the metaphysics or the literal interpretation. If you want to call religion a convenient fiction, then, well, so is the theory of relativity, right? Given that it clashes with quantum mechanics, and we still have not found a way to reliably test models that unify both of them. We have to choose some explanation of our existence that's motivational enough to get us to perpetuate it, and we might as well synthesize as much available wisdom as possible in the meantime. So, lucky us to live in the modern world then, right? So, okay, time for the uncomfortable part. Pick the person you hate most. It could be a politician, celebrity, public figure, or just someone in your actual life. Now do this exercise. List 3 genuine positives about them. And I'm not talking about backhanded compliments like they're really good at lying and manipulation, but actual traits that you'd be willing to have more of yourself, whether it's work ethic, courage, discipline, charisma, loyalty, creativity, whatever it is. Admit where you share a flaw, take the thing you despise most in them, and ask, where is this same tendency showing up in me, even at 5 or 10% of the intensity? How is that sabotaging my life? And then imagine their origin story. You don't have to excuse anything, but just ask, if I had their experiences, their upbringing, their incentives, is it guaranteed I'd be any different? Remember that contact theory and related research show that seeing out-group members as complex and partially admirable, even in one-off exposures, can reduce anxiety, increase empathy, and soften extreme prejudice. And it does not require you to abandon any of your moral convictions. You can still fight harmful policies, call out lies, and defend your values. What it does do is prevent a kind of moral self-delusion, pretending we're totally clean while benefiting from systems that we criticize, or pretending our opponents are simple cartoon villains with zero redeeming qualities. How much time do you want to spend rehearsing hatred of simplified enemies instead of learning from and being inspired by real complex human beings, including the ones you strongly oppose? And in closing, here's the core idea again. The fierce urgency of now. If fear is why you're waiting, then tomorrow is infinity. And then, civilization's fragility. We're never more than a couple of bad decades away from losing more than we realize, if you know what I mean. And then correctism. Almost anyone is a little bit correct from some angle, and you can steal their best parts and appreciate that. On politics and markets, life is, in many ways, a game of system gaming. You don't have to like the players to learn their strategies. On religion and tradition, old stories survive because they solve real problems. You can mine them for wisdom without surrendering your mind. You don't have to like everyone, or anyone. You definitely don't have to agree with everyone. But if you commit to finding one thing you can learn from every person, from your favorite leader to your worst enemy, you can become harder to manipulate, harder to polarize, and a lot more interesting than the average partisan hack. That's the invitation here. This has been Lumen et Ratio. Feel free to discuss, constructively criticize, debunk, or whatever. All I ask is for civil discourse, which is an art we must restore to modern civilization. Thank you.